Laura. We're all members of the Bay Area Sea Kayakers.
Cool.
I'm a paddler and the president. Yuan is the vice president, and you know him, obviously.
We've actually never met.
Oh,
we
okay.
have a mutual friend and became Facebook friends, and now we know everything about each other.
There you go. There you go. And Ellen is a supreme paddler, a big contributor to Basque, and a professor of biology at Berkeley.
Oh, cool. I did my undergrad in biology at Berkeley.
Laura, if you could please introduce yourself.
Hi, my name's Laura, or Laura Alice Watt is my full name. And I have, for the last 15 years, been a professor at Sonoma State University, but I recently took early retirement a little bit, or definitely early, and have relocated to the northwest corner of Iceland. So coming to you from a blizzard, which is kind of exciting. And I did my PhD at Berkeley long ago, as well as my undergrad. So I've been hanging around the Bay Area all my life, and I did my dissertation on Point Reyes. Back then I was interested in asking the question, what happens to a landscape that people live in when it becomes the object of preservation in the United States? And that then, that the dissertation, I guess, was done in 2001. And after I got the job at Sonoma State, it very slowly started to turn into a book, although a lot had already happened and continued to happen. So I was in this odd position of writing the history of something while I didn't know the ending. But I have a really interdisciplinary background. I have an undergrad in biology, a master's in environmental management, and worked as an environmental planner for 4 years before the Sonoma State job came along. And now I consider myself either an environmental historian or a historical geographer or something in there. So I use a lot of different kinds of data points. I'm just really interested in the relationship between people and the places that they live in and work in and play in, and trying to understand human relationships with the natural world and what that tells us about both sort of sides is kind of what I do.
Well, that's great. And so I
take pictures. I take a lot of pictures.
You take pictures. So I think Yuan made the connection with you. And I think what's really interesting to us is your perspective on what is a wilderness and how the history of human occupation and activities impact our view of the wilderness. It even gets into the class divisions of how people look at wilderness. Your stuff about Yosemite is quite interesting. And you're also a sailor who knows the aquatic environment, and you know all about Drake's.
I know how to be on top of it. I don't go in it very often. I try to avoid that.
Well, we try to avoid going in it. We're trying to stay on top as well. So that's interesting. I think some of the things we can talk about, are as Yuan was describing our interactions with the new closures having to do with birds and the sort of weak science in regard to us, and how does the national parks, how do they use science, and your experience with that? And the Tule elk issue is kind of the hot one now. Yeah. So Ellen, you were asking a question, I think, before we started recording. Did you want to?
I was asking.
You were asking, or I could just start. Oh, go ahead.
Maybe, Laura, you could start and say something about wilderness in general. One of the presentations with you I saw, or recordings of you I saw, you were talking about wilderness with a capital W. And yeah, maybe you could say something about that.
Sure. Just I'll try and keep it brief and not slip into professor mode too much. If I ramble on too much, just wave your arms or something. Stop. Wilderness is a really interesting idea because it's not a uniquely American idea. It sort of emerged from the US in a lot of ways and now has sort of spread around the world. And one of the interesting things about living here in Iceland is seeing how that idea with increased US tourism is changing how Icelanders think about the natural world around them. As this idea sort of takes hold. But anyway, wilderness is a fairly new idea in human history. Wildernesses used to always be scary, terrible places that you really wanted to avoid whenever possible, or definitely if possible, to tame them and domesticate them and eradicate anything wild about them. Because what wild really means, the literal meaning of the word, if you get down to the etymology, is something that has a will of its own, something that's self-willed and isn't controllable or isn't predictable. And so if you're, clinging to the shores of a new continent and you're surrounded by forests full of animals and people that you've never seen before and you don't understand, then that's terrifying. But sometime, in sort of the 1700s in Europe and the 1800s in the United States, as those places became more urbanized, you see a switch of people starting to value the wild character of places and of animals, and of seeking to retain that as many places become more urbanized and sort of overly controlled in their minds. But the point is often made that it is you only get that kind of view of wilderness from the city, when you are removed from it and you're looking back. And then, there's sort of, I think that's part of why there's still a lot of polarization around ideas of wilderness, that oftentimes people who live in more rural spaces and are still on in a very close relationship with the wild and the unpredictability and how it can actually, make their lives difficult. They often don't have the same kind of idealization of what wilderness is that urban people do. Not to say that all urban people idealize it, but that it is often a more distant and relationship that sort of gets more at the sort of the awe and the grandeur or the mystery of wilderness, as opposed to the practicalities of how do you deal with whatever it is that's popping up in your face and making life difficult. But then also wilderness in the United States has been a very a troubling idea, in that it overlooks the existence of Native Americans completely. It really just bypasses them. And in fact, there were some really bizarre arguments in early wilderness legislation hearings, if you go and look through the transcripts, where people are sort of arguing about, well, what do we do with places like Chaco Canyon, where there's really obvious remains of people? But they're like, oh, but those are people that aren't here anymore. We don't have to worry about that. They're part of nature. And so there's this tendency in, our past, and we still deal with the legacy of this, to equate Native Americans with the natural world, as if they were not quite human, or just differently human, or etc. And so sort of, like I said, bypass any impact they might have had on what is in what we consider a wilderness. And what, ecological science, among other things, are really, showing more and more and more in recent decades, is just how profoundly Native Americans were managing the landscapes around them. And so almost every place we think of as a pristine wilderness is actually a human created wilderness at some level, at least humans participating in its creation, along with the climate and the plant species and the animals and everything else that's there. And some places obviously more managed than others, but here in California, I'm not there, but there in California, California had one of the densest populations of Native people in the continental US. So almost any place in California has a fair degree of managed quality to it.
I think Tending the Wild by Katz. I don't know if you've read that book, but it's a wonderful description of just how rich.
Yes.
Yeah, Kat Anderson. I've been assigning from it for years.
Yeah.
Fabulous book. Everyone in California should be required to read that book, I think.
Maybe you could.
Yeah, I'll have to say her book, that book, I'm a botanist, and so she really focused a lot on plant materials, because the Native peoples in California used plant materials in really unique ways compared to other societies.
Mm-hmm.
And her book that really quantifying how much plant material people were using had a huge impact on my thinking about wilderness and what does it mean to rescue land and to preserve areas. Had a huge impact on me.
So I'd like to focus it on Point Reyes for a moment. Maybe you could apply what you just said
Yeah.
to Point Reyes, historically, what is Point Reyes
Yeah.
and as a wilderness and such?
Yeah, so Point Reyes, well, one of the things that actually only kind of occurred to me fairly late in the process of writing my book, which in case anyone didn't know is called The Paradox of Preservation. The paradox being that when you try and preserve something, you think you're holding it still and keeping it the same. And what actually happens is it changes because of what you're doing to preserve it. Just like a cucumber changes when you turn it into a pickle. You can keep it around longer, but it's not the same thing. So that's sort of the one-liner from the book. But anyway, when kind of late in the process of writing the book, it is when it finally occurred to me that coastal grasslands in California, for the most part, I'm sure there are some exceptions, and I defer to the botanist on the screen, but most coastal grasslands cannot stay open on their own. If you leave them alone and don't burn them or mow them or graze them, they will be infiltrated by coyote brush and small Douglas fir trees, and depending on where you are, other species that will eventually take over. The grasses do not hold their own over time. And so, Point Reyes is sort of known as this, these beautiful rolling hills of green, green gorgeousness in the springtime, and then the gold in the summer. And it was always described, when I was reading about the history of the last 150 years at Point Reyes, which is really the focus. I'm a fairly recent times historian, so I was really interested in sort of 1850 to the present, and not focusing so much on the native history because it's not my field and I don't want to presume to dive into it. But there's a lot of description of in the 1850s, 1860s of Point Reyes as just being cow heaven, because it's these gorgeous pastures that get more water than most other places in California because of the fog. We all know how foggy Point Reyes can be. And it was only, like I said, late in the game that I was like, well, why was it so grassy? And of course, before the dairies got established, there were Mexican rancheros from the 1830s that got established. They're running free range cattle and also hunting the deer and tule elk that were living there for the hide and tallow trade, where they're killing the animals and skinning them and collecting the fat from their bodies and shipping those things because they're more shippable at that point. And before them, why did they show up and think this was a great place to bring their cattle? Well, it's because Native people were burning this landscape pretty frequently to keep it open, both to select for certain kinds of plants that they wanted to use in their, either for food or building materials or whatever else, and various practices of daily life, and also to make it easier to hunt game. And this is what they were doing across much of the West, and in fact, much of the country, is using frequent low intensity fire to make the landscape more usable and more manageable, and the variety of things that they wanted to use. So there's an odd continuity in the kinds of uses. Even though the kinds of uses of this landscape have changed, they've maintained this grassland ecosystem. And then when a wilderness ethos comes along in 1976, which is when the wilderness area in Point Reyes was first established in the southern portion of the park, the wilderness ethos is hands off, don't do anything, don't have any mechanical uses, and also, don't manage it, don't have cows on it, suppress fire when you can. Because fire is still seen as a dangerous thing. And you've got Inverness right on the other side of the ridge, and those people don't want their houses to burn down. And so that's actually a very new form of managing this ecosystem that it hasn't seen in hundreds or thousands of years, of just being left alone. And when you look at, old aerial photos of pre-park establishment for the southern portion of the peninsula, the vegetation just changes completely after 76, where it's now dominated by coyote brush and Doug fir forest and remnant trees from the old ranches. But it's not that it's a better or worse ecosystem, but it's just a very different ecosystem. And I think it's an ecosystem that humans have created without intending to, or without, sort of expressing, acknowledging that that's what the outcome was going to be. There was sort of this imagination that the grasslands would just be there forever. And so that's where, in terms of sort of the ecological side or the land management side, the creation of the protection of wilderness at Point Reyes has been the creation of a new landscape, as opposed to holding still of an existing landscape or a pre-existing landscape. And in terms of the human side, because of course I'm always interested in looking at it from both angles, it was the work of those people, from the Miwok through the Spanish Mexicans, through the dairy operations starting in the late 1850s, that created those grasslands. And so there's actually a really interesting, when you go back and read through, which is what I do as a geeky historian, I go and read transcripts of congressional hearings and statements by congressmen and questions from the public and all these other things, and sort of how did we make this decision to create a wilderness area in a place that was certainly, it was not, you couldn't imagine that it was like the High Sierra, where it looks like it's just been pristine for a really long time and you're just sort of continuing to keep it that way. It was very obvious at Point Reyes that there had been large ranches in the area that became wilderness and that they were being removed. The old pavement from the ranch roads was being taken off. There was a very active creating of wilderness there. But when you read through all these transcripts of hearings and so forth, there's a real recognition, even from, I remember there's a quote from, I think, the attorney for the Ranchers Association back in the early 60s, where he's saying that, it's important to remember that these rolling hills, these grasslands were made by human activity, and that not recognizing that role in creating the landscape opens up the possibility that either the landscape will change, or that you lose it, or that you're just not sort of giving what's the right word, giving acknowledgement of that role. And that that often does happen when people sort of say, oh, we're just going to manage this place as a natural space, and they don't acknowledge the kind of role that human management has, whether it's from Native people or ranching people or anyone else, the park managers themselves. Without that acknowledgement, you can often inadvertently change things or lose things that you hoped to protect.
So we're regularly introduced to controversial issues having to do with Point Reyes, whether it's the Tule Elk or the oyster farm or the Estero. And I'm trying to think, how do we translate that perspective into, our own ideas about how to react? We want to paddle in the Estero and we want it to seem like some kind of natural environment, but how do we know what that should be? And should we hate the cows? Should we like the cows?
Well,
I think this is one of the things that when I first moved back to California 22 years ago, and after being on the East Coast for years and learning my ecology and so on the East Coast, coming back here and having been brought up in this ethos of wilderness and preserving wilderness, around the time that I arrived back here, I really had started reading a lot of material about Native Americans. I had taught a course at University of Chicago to non-majors about how the natural world affects human history. And I used some of the documents about Native Americans and the effects of European expansion and colonization, the early effects, you know, the diseases that came in and the transformations of the landscape that happened because of the depopulation of the continent. Well, not just North America, but also South America.
Yeah.
And so when I came back to California and was confronting this idea of how do we preserve things? What does it mean to preserve a landscape? I started wrestling with this idea of as an ecologist, you understand this concept of what's called natural succession. Succession is something, it's been studied, for example, in areas where glaciers are retreating and the vegetation changes very rapidly as the glaciers retreat, and it undergoes all kind of this very fairly systematic change in what plants are there and so on. And the same things that you're describing happening at Point Reyes are the same kind of situation, that you stop some natural or it doesn't have to be natural, although then one has to start asking, well, what does it mean for us to not be natural?
Right.
And it really causes you to, I'll have to say from a personal experience, it really transformed my entire view of what humans are and how we participate in the landscape and in the world, and this Descartesian dualism of, you know, nature and humans, and it really upended that. And your book, I think, sort of is providing that same kind of perspective, and I think it's a perspective that is spreading among young people. But for a lot of us who grew up in the wilderness romance ethic, it's really destabilizing in many ways, and it's very difficult to.
Yeah, and there's an interesting tension in that. You know, there's a tendency, there's sort of this idealization of wilderness as wild, as this you know, self-propelled, unpredictable, chaotic thing, and yet, as this is where I've actually been really interested in the history of science, and particularly the history of ecology as it develops as a part of this whole conversation, because when ecology develops as a science with you know, sort of the classic studies by Frederick Clements on identifying succession as a theory and then refining it, there's a real sense of nature being this very predictable force that, you know, he's like, you know, plant communities will go through this very predictable process, just like a human grows from being an infant to being an adult. You can't go straight from infant to adult. You have to go through all these different stages, and they're very predictable, and you can tell what's going to happen next, and blah, blah, blah. And that's actually runs very counter to the idea of nature as this wild, crazy thing with a will of its own. And it's been, the more I've sort of read about that, and in fairly recent years, it's really striking how the metaphor of the balance of nature, or the harmony of nature, that you know, became very commonplace after sort of the 1970s movement of, you know, sort of saying this is something humans need to protect because we're ruining things. That metaphor is damaging in its own way, because nature is not naturally harmonious. I'm the daughter of an evolutionary biologist, so if anything, I grew up with the idea that everything changes over time and nothing stays the same. And yet, you know, you don't want to say, well, everything changes, so anything goes. We can change anything, and it's all natural. And so, you know, there's always going to be this tension of, you know, are humans inside the bubble that's natural? Well, yes, we evolved from other forms, and, you know, we're all part of this process, but we're also outside of it in a way. Because you don't want to, I don't think it's helpful to define all human action as natural, therefore great.
Well, but then, I mean, what the issue that it raises is that then, if we were to define all human action as natural, then it necessitates deciding who gets to decide what things are valued and what things are not. And I think this is a key aspect of what's happening at Point Reyes, in all these conflicts about oysters and elk and white deer and so on. is that that wilderness ideal isn't holding very well anymore, because as you've pointed out, it doesn't stay pristine, it changes. And and if it does stay, if we want to call it pristine and unmanaged, what it becomes is something that we're not that happy with. We don't like a situation, a landscape that we can't walk through because it's filled with poison oak. For example, I'm thinking about the area around Big Sur. And so then that necessitates an extremely difficult discussion about who gets to decide what do we value and what do we want this public land to be. Right. And I think that's a large part of right now what's happening with these arguments about what happens with wilderness or with national parks, is that we're wrestling with this problem of who gets the power to make those decisions and what are our values.
Yeah, and even though I think in academic or even management circles, as the recognition of the impact of Native Americans and the sort of ways in which the idealization of wilderness is sort of coming apart a bit, I think as a public concept, it's still incredibly powerful for people who do not work and think about this stuff every day. And so that's one thing that I have really been surprised is not the right word, but a little surprised by over the watching the years of controversies come and go at Point Reyes, is just how deeply powerful that sort of the harmony of nature, the balance, the sense that humans are always a disruptive force unless they're just recreating. And that recreation tends to be seen as having no impact. And I'm sure the kayakers probably are like, but no, they say that we're impacting. But in sort of the general public sphere, there is a tendency to see, going and taking pictures and going for a hike as benign. It has no impact unless the numbers get so high that it becomes a traffic jam, like in Yosemite Valley. And so, but there's a presumption that any commercial use of the landscape is harmful, but again, overlooking commercial uses that are recreation focused. So someone, a kayak group that's going out for hire is in a way using the estuary in a commercial sense, but that's not seen as a problematic commercial sense. So there's a tendency to split up human activity, to make a divide between work and play, and assume that play is going to be okay, if not directly harmful, at least fairly benign, and that work is going to be a problem, without actually looking at what the actual results are and the data of what may or may not be happening in that landscape.
Yeah, I love the image you talked about when you go through the tunnel in Yosemite and you see the beautiful valley, but really Curry Village is off there, just out of, off stage, right? So that's okay because it serves, recreational uses, but they're hiding it from the viewpoint. It's sort of a visual metaphor of what you're saying.
Well, and that's, I think, one of the things that, and this is not unique to Point Reyes, this is something that's across the United States, and why Point Reyes, to me, I often got the question or argument as I was working on this project of, well, isn't Point Reyes just so unique because there aren't a lot of other national parks that have active agriculture in them, although there are some, more than people think there are. But in a way, I think of it as a harbinger for many parks, because it is a place where work and play are expressly in the park side by side. And we're going to have to be making these decisions and using judgment, because that's all we have to work with about how to manage these places going forward. And one of the underlying things that has made, I think, the conversation at Point Reyes and other parks so difficult is the tendency in the US to equate national parks with pristine nature, if not wilderness, and a healthy ecosystem, where really, when you go back to the start of the parks, the focus of the parks was all about iconic scenery and had nothing to do with the ecological state of what was in the scenery. It was just pretty. And that's what we wanted. Pretty and awe-inspiring and different from your daily life. And so the ways in which the earliest parks, Yosemite and Yellowstone and so forth, were set up and managed even before the Park Service itself existed, are all geared towards creating, finding the view, the best views, choreographing the visitors to get to those views, and never letting those views change. And what's striking when I give a lecture on this topic, I often use both photographs and paintings from the late 1800s of Yosemite Valley, because it's so relatively well known in the US, at least. I was teaching a class to a lot of international students this last fall, and I couldn't say, "You've all been there, right?" They looked at me blankly. But anyway, if you look at the paintings of what the ecosystem of the valley looked like just at the time of its preservation, it's wildly different than it is today.
The other thing that's really different about the landscapes that were being preserved as national parks and also national forests and so on, is that they were not being used by Westerners, and that's true of much of the landscape that we've preserved, is that it's the landscape that was left over that wasn't as useful, a large part of it, especially the earlier parks. Yeah, by the people who had the power to designate these lands as protected. And over time, we've run out of those landscapes. We've discovered that most landscapes have something that's useful, either above ground or underground. And so preservation, my sense is that, and you may correct me, my sense is that preservation has started to encounter this issue even more intensively, more recently in the last 50 years or 100 years, 50 years, I guess. And so one thing that I was curious to ask you about is how you would compare what's happened at Point Reyes with what MALT has done, the Marine Agricultural Land Trust, and then the Sonoma Land Trust, and the idea of maintaining these working landscapes. And I was wondering if you could, because many of the landscapes that we admire from our kayaks when we're paddling, for example, in Tomales Bay, are working landscapes that are privately owned, and that MALT has been really important in protecting.
Yeah, and one of the interesting things that that I go into a lot more detail about in the book, and I'll try and be brief about here, is that you're right. Early parks were created pretty much by just telling everybody you can't, homestead here. They were lands that already belonged to the federal government for a variety of reasons, and then they just excluded new settlement, sometimes rather forcefully. There were definitely cases of people being chucked out, particularly Native Americans, but also early settlers. Then people would say, "No, you shouldn't be wanting to settle in such a scenic place. What's wrong with you?" Which is sort of funny. But anyway, as early as the 19-teens is when you get your first parks being created out of private lands, because the East Coast doesn't have a lot of federal land. And once the National Park Service was created, they wanted to be a national agency. And so they wanted parks in the East Coast. So you get Acadia National Park being created through donations from very wealthy families like Rockefeller. And you get parks like Shenandoah being created by the states involved, in this case, Virginia, condemning all the land that people were living on and farming and kicking them off and giving the land to the federal government to create this new wilderness park conveniently close to Congress, who is, of course, appropriating all the money to pay for it. So there's sort of this continuum of creating parks out of private lands. And Point Reyes is, again, particularly interesting because it's one of the first ones where Congress actually gave the Park Service the authority to acquire land directly, instead of relying on donations from either individuals or states. And Congress continued to grant Park Service acquisition authority through the 1960s and 70s. And mostly this is creating national seashores, national lake shores, and national recreation areas. A big push to create more parks close to urban areas, in part to just feed demand. The huge boom in outdoor recreation in the 1960s after the recovery from World War II, and also to again, have parks close to lots of voters that will then help approve more money for the Park Service. So there's definitely a lot of political things going on. But what's interesting is every time the Park Service has this authority to acquire land directly, to go and purchase private land and make a park out of it, it ends up causing controversy. Almost every single place it does this, across the country in a lot of different circumstances. And by 1978, there's a huge omnibus bill that Congress passes in 1978 that creates, I think, 3 or 4 new parks and augments a whole bunch more and all this. But they no longer allow that ability to acquire directly. Now, after 78, all of the parks created are circumstances where the Park Service is going to have to be a partner. They're often called partnership parks. Santa Monica Mountains is one of the first ones created in that 1978 bill. And I think the Park Service owns about 40% of the land within the boundary of the park. It's less than half. There's state land, there's private land, there's nonprofit owned land. There's, this whole smorgasbord of different owners. And that was then seen as okay. During the 60s and 70s, there was still this ethos that if you're going to make it into a park, if you're going to manage it, you have to own it. Point Reyes is interesting because it did start off looking like it was going to be a partnership park. The first bill passed in 1962 kept the main ranches in the northern section of the peninsula in private ownership. They were not allowed to acquire anything over 500 acres that was in agricultural use. And this was a political necessity to get the bill passed because everybody in Marin County, from the Chamber of Commerce to the elected officials to almost all the organizations they talked to, did not want them shutting down the ranches. There was a fear that it would wipe out the local economy, for one thing, but also that these were our neighbors and our friends and our family in many cases. And so there was this sense that we were excited about a park, but we want a park that allows ranching to stay in place. And it's only through a whole bunch of odd steps, some of which are just chance and some of which may have been intentional. It's not clear from the historic record, but where full acquisition of all the ranches by 1970 became a financial necessity for the ranchers. And the Park Service had run out of money. They had used all the money that Congress gave them, and they had only acquired like 5 or 6 ranches. They'd only had pieces of a park. So the whole concept of it being a park was really in trouble unless they got more money. That transition happens in 1970 when Congress says, here's some more money, we'll allow you now to acquire land. But the chairman of the committee that passed this bill and got Nixon to sign it explicitly said, we still want ranchers to be able to stay if they want to. This is something that Congress intends with this change. It's not, even though we're allowing acquisition of the land, we're not trying to take it away from these people. Malt ends up being created in 1980. So part of this is just a chance of timing. I think if the acquisition bill to the Save the Seashore effort in the late 60s, creating this bill in 1970, if that had happened 10 years later, it would have looked very different. It would have looked much more like a partnership park. It would have probably stayed in private ownership, but with conservation easements, which is how Malt protects land. The land stays in the family's ownership, usually it's families, but the development rights have been taken off. That reduces both the value of the land. They can't develop it. It can't turn into McMansions or ranchettes, but it also reduces the property taxes. And most importantly, it reduces the inheritance taxes. This was something that was facing almost all of the ranching families in the park when it was called the hole in the donut. the ranching zone was left in private ownership. So they couldn't, they owned it, but they couldn't sell it to just anybody. But if there was a generational turnover, they were going to owe about half the value of that ranch in taxes, and they had no money to pay it with unless they could sell the ranch, and they didn't want to sell the ranch. So this is part of why you end up with acquisition of private land, even though the intention was to keep it privately owned. And then, you know, malt did come along 10 years later. It emerged out of the environmental crisis of the 1970s drought, where there was a recognition that environmentalists and ranchers actually had some things in common, because they both wanted the land to stay healthy. And they both wanted to prevent basically Walnut Creek from happening in Point Reyes or in West Marin, right? You know, we didn't want, or Palo Alto, which is where I grew up. You know, we didn't want suburban development to take over. And so the common enemy for both ranchers and environmentalists at that point was development. And so they saw that there was something in common. And that's where I think there's, you know, Phyllis Faber, who with Alan Strauss created malt in the first place, and was the first agricultural land trust in the country to use those conservation tools to help protect working lands, huge heroes of mine. And I feel like in recent years, with a lot of the controversies that have bubbled up at Point Reyes over the oyster farm, over the non-native deer, over the tule elk, it's really unfortunately eroded that sense of common interest between ranchers and environmentalists that I think are just inherently there. So I'm hoping that somehow the conversation can get steered back. Maybe, you know, maybe that'll be a silver lining of the recent wildfires or the recent droughts.
Yeah, and I mean, one of the things that is interesting to me is that the ranchers have maintained the landscape the way the Indians had maintained it, the Native Americans. And the National Park Service instead has transformed the landscape into something that's very different than what they intended to preserve.
Yeah.
I think that's a really interesting conundrum or paradox.
Let's, we've been going for 49 minutes. This conversation, I think, could go for a few more hours. It's really interesting. And
It's
really
always
good.
fun to talk about.
It's fun. It's good. And I hope it gives our members an interesting perspective on Point Reyes. How should we conclude this? What do you guys think?
Well, one thing just really quickly, I think thinking of, because you had asked me an email, sort of what should recreational kayakers be thinking about, or sort of as they're paddling along. And I've only sea kayaked a few times, but I'd love to do it again. So hopefully I'll get back there and you guys can take me out someday. I do think that, you know, thinking of a lot of these dualisms, both not only sort of nature and culture, working land versus wilderness, also private land and public land, or, you know, park and malt. You know, there's a lot of these sort of dualisms that you see very clearly on the landscape there. And I would love to encourage people to see, instead of it looking at it as either or, as a battle, to see it as a both and. It's like, how can we maintain this mosaic of private, public, nature, culture, wild, domesticated, commercial, non-commercial. There's nothing inherently harmful about a commercial use of something if it's doing it in a careful and thoughtful way that is sustainable. In the, you know, I hate the sort of canned version of sustainability where it's just become sort of a green label, but where you really think about something persisting through time. You know, the one of the things that always, and again, I worked as an environmental planner for 4 years and wrote a lot of big resource management plans for the BLM in the case of the work I was doing, not the Park Service up on the north coast of California. But one of the things that really struck me when people are talking about environmental impact statements and sort of trying to say, well, what's the impact of this or that use of the land, is to say, well, what's the baseline you're measuring it from? Because if you're measuring the baseline at Point Reyes from what has been there before whatever action you're considering. You know, ranching has been there for 170 years now for dairy and beef. Before that, it was the free range cattle. Before that, it was native people. So the baseline has been one of human use. And I think that you should be looking at environmental impacts from that baseline. The tendency in many of the recent documents has been to look at environmental impacts from some imaginary baseline that has never existed, or at least not for a really long time, where there is no human use at all. And so that ends up distorting the process, which then the public has input in. We can, you know, make our public comments and so on, but we're looking at it through this weird lens of what the impact would be if nothing that's there was actually there and you were just doing this impact in a vacuum. So that's one thing to think about, is sort of from what do you measure? And I just had an idea of what I was going to say next and I forgot what it was. I think, you know, just to steer back to that both end of, you know, what's gained by eliminating something as opposed to keeping two things side by side. Point Reyes has always been so powerful to me because it does now have a wilderness area next to working farms, and they both can persist. Oh, that was what I was thinking of when people are saying, oh, you know, gosh, the ranches are so harmful environmentally, but the environment that's, you know, they've been there for 170 years. And if they haven't destroyed it yet, it can't be that harmful, you know, because it's managed to persist, to stay there, to be in existence. So that by definition is not harming it. And that doesn't mean that there aren't ways of improving practices and, you know, making things more compatible. And the last thing that is, I may be getting away from the ranchers a little bit, but is to remember that also that, you know, the Point Reyes was created in 1962 as a national seashore. The whole emphasis of that was to create public access for beach recreation. That was the entire purpose of setting up this park. And it was one where, again, they decided to try and accommodate the active ranches as part of doing that, because it wasn't seen as incompatible with public access for recreation. As the ecosystem within the park changes and the, you know, presence or absence of different species changes. I remember when I was working on this dissertation, it wasn't the bird closures that you guys are dealing with, but there were at least proposed at that point, and I think they were instituted, a bunch of beach closures for elephant seal pupping, because the elephant seals had not been in Point Reyes when I was a kid. They were down at Año Nuevo. They were still slowly working their way up the coast after having been almost wiped out in the 1870s. But now they're gajillions of them. They're continuing to go further north. And so I think at some point it does beg the question of, does the presence of a natural species, especially one that isn't in trouble, that's doing fine, does that always trump human use? I don't think it should. I think there's got to be a balance of saying, you know, yeah, it's there. Elephant seals have lots of places where they can pup, or, you know, depending on the birds. I don't know what the circumstances are of the bird closures that you guys have been dealing with, you know, but there's often this sense of, oh, nature needs it, so people just have to back off. And I worry that what we're ending up creating is a series of protected spaces where the managers of those protected spaces have access and nobody else does. And I'm not sure that's really what we set out to do when we created parks and protected areas.
Okay, thank you. On that note, just I think we should call it a day because I want to keep it under a reasonable time.
Yeah, and if people from listening to this or from reading any of the stuff I've written have further questions, I'm either happy to do a second thing or answer stuff by email or whatever.
Great, we will we'll offer that. I'm sure there will be questions. It's a club that doesn't hide its opinions.
Excellent.
Great. Thank you for your time, especially at
Yes.
the, you know, making it work out with your time change.
Yes, I'm
And-
sorry I couldn't attend not in person, but at your usual time meeting, but it would have been at 3 a.m. here and I'm just
Yeah.
not
Okay.
that committed.
Yeah. And stay safe in the blizzard out your window there.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yuan, I'll talk to you about transferring the recording. And
Yeah, that sounds good.
Okay.
Thank you so much, Laura. And
Yeah.
if you come to California anytime soon, I
Oh.
hope you give me a call, and I would love to take you out and show you some
Awesome.
places that are
Yeah.
only accessible by kayak.
yeah.
I may possibly be in California in March. There's an environmental history conference up in Oregon, and I want to see my mom, who's still down in Menlo Park. So
Oh, okay.
I may be
Come by.
there.
We'll go paddling.
Awesome.
Good. Okay.
All right. Take care.